You say sorry when someone bumps into you. You apologize for taking up space in a conversation. You say sorry to bother you before asking a completely reasonable question. And sometimes you're not even sure what you're apologizing for. You just feel this pull, this automatic reflex, like something inside you needs to smooth everything over before anyone even notices there's something to smooth. This doesn't look like guilt. It doesn't feel like guilt either, but it keeps happening, and maybe you've wondered why. Here's what's actually going on. You are not anxious. You are not a pushover. You are not weak. You are someone whose nervous system learned a very specific lesson early on, that peace is fragile, and that you are responsible for protecting it. That lesson made sense when you learned it, and your brain, being the loyal and protective thing it is, never stopped plying it. This is not a flaw. This is adaptation. And when you understand where it comes from, the whole thing starts to look a lot less like a bad habit and a lot more like an act of quiet survival. The first thing to understand is that this usually starts in an environment where emotional tension was unpredictable. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily loud. Sometimes it was subtle. A parent whose mood shifted without warning. A home where silence meant something was wrong. A relationship where love felt conditional on keeping everything calm. When you grow up in that kind of atmosphere, your nervous system starts scanning constantly. It learns to detect the earliest signs of tension and neutralize them before anything escalates. The apology becomes a tool, a fast, reliable tool. Say sorry first, and maybe nothing bad happens. Maybe the air stays clear. Maybe you stay safe. Think about a child who learns to say, "I'm sorry," before they even understand what they did. They're not confused about morality. They're responding to emotional cues. They're learning that the apology itself carries power, not because of meaning, but because of effect. It softens, it diffuses, it works, and the brain remembers what works. But here's the part nobody tells you. That same reflex follows you into adulthood, into relationships where the threat is no longer real. You're not in that childhood room anymore, but your body doesn't always know that. So when there's conflict at work, you apologize. When someone seems quiet, you apologize. When you ask for something you're completely entitled to, you apologize. The situation has changed. The software hasn't updated. Psychologists often connect this to what's called anxious attachment, a way of relating to others where closeness feels precious but fragile, and where disapproval can feel like abandonment. People with anxious attachment tend to monitor others carefully. They're skilled at reading rooms, and they often manage their anxiety by making themselves smaller, less inconvenient, easier to be around. The apology fits naturally into that pattern. It's a preemptive move, a way of saying without words, "I am not a threat. Please don't leave." There's also something deeper happening around identity. When you apologize constantly, even when you haven't done anything wrong, you're often not apologizing for an action. You're apologizing for existing in a way that might inconvenience someone, for having needs, for having feelings that someone else might have to navigate. Somewhere along the way, you internalize the idea that your presence comes with a cost, and that you need to manage that cost carefully. That belief lives below the surface. Most people who carry it don't know it's there. They just feel the familiar pull, the reflex, and follow it. And this is where it gets interesting, because the apology, in its own strange way, is a form of control. Not manipulation, nothing like that, but control in the sense of, if I say sorry first, I decide how this moment goes. I don't have to wait and wonder. I don't have to sit in the discomfort of not knowing how someone might react. The apology collapses that uncertainty. It ends the suspense. And for a nervous system that finds unpredictability genuinely threatening, that collapse feels like relief. It's an anchor. In a moment that feels like open water, unstable, unreadable, the apology is something solid to grab. It restores a sense of ground. It doesn't solve anything, but it makes the world feel briefly, mercifully manageable. What's also worth knowing is that this behavior shifts across your life.
In your teens, the apology might be about fitting in, about not being the person who causes friction in a group. In your 20s, it might show up in romantic relationships, in how quickly you abandon your own perspective the moment someone pushes back. In your 30s and beyond, it often becomes quieter but more pervasive, woven so naturally into how you communicate that you stop noticing it. The behavior doesn't disappear as you age, it just changes shape. It gets more sophisticated, more invisible, more automatic. But the root stays the same, a learned belief that your emotional comfort matters less than the comfort of the room. There's something quietly exhausting about this, because every time you apologize for something you didn't do, you're spending emotional energy that doesn't need to be spent. You're managing a threat that isn't there. And over time, that cost accumulates. Not in dramatic ways, in small ones. In moments where you wonder why you always feel slightly at fault, slightly not enough. The apology feels like resolution, but it doesn't actually resolve anything inside you. It just resets the external environment so you can keep going. Think of it like an old coat you put on because the weather used to be cold. The coat did its job. It kept you warm when you needed it. But some days you're still reaching for it out of habit, out of memory, even when the sun is out. The coat is not the problem. The weather changed. That's all. What you carry isn't brokenness, it's history. It's a very human response to an environment that asked something of you before you were old enough to understand what was being asked. You learned to keep the peace because keeping the peace once meant something real. It meant safety. It meant connection. It meant the people you loved stayed close. That learning shaped you, and it will keep shaping you, not because you're stuck, but because the nervous system is slow to unlearn what it once needed to survive. So if you find yourself apologizing again for speaking too much, for asking, for simply being present, maybe instead of frustration, there can be something gentler, a small recognition that some part of you is still trying to protect you, still doing its best with the information it has. That part of you is not the enemy. It's just a little behind. And that's very, very human.